and thank you for joining me for Saturday Night Crafting. My name is Sasha Reed, and every Saturday night I try and bring you a new technique to try and something fun to get your creative juices flowing. Tonight is all about embossing, so we are doing embossing folders and embossing powders. So this is why we are doing double and triple embossing. So this first part of my video is all about double embossing, where we're going to take an embossing folder and we are going to use embossing powder with it. So I've got a brayer, some embossing ink, embossing powder, and this lovely folder from Lisa Horton Crafts. All my embossing folders I'm using today are from Lisa Horton. They're new in my stash and I absolutely love them. They are 3D embossing folders, so you really get a wow factor when it comes to doing some triple embossing. So getting started, I am inking up my bumpy side of my embossing folder. So on the right is the bumpy and on the left is the indented, so that when you pull out your panel, your embossing ink is then sort of reversed. It's now inside those dents. I find that works the best for my embossing, especially when it comes to triple embossing. So here you can see how it looks. I've got some bits there where some embossing powder stuck where I didn't want it to stick, and I'm just going to take a paintbrush and I'm going to kind of lie it slightly flat and then kind of rub off that embossing powder where it got where I didn't want it to go. Now this is the reason we're going to use a brayer. It's that we can have more control over where that ink goes. Now embossing ink is really sticky and it can be really hard to get off of things like your brayer and your embossing folders, but if you've got some rubbing alcohol or isopropyl alcohol, a couple of spritzes of that on there or a bit on a cloth and it will wipe off so easily. It is such a handy trick to do. Now as I'm heat setting this and melting that embossing powder, you can see the panel on the right. Now that is the panel where I took my embossing pad and I did direct to the embossing folder, not using a brayer. And you can see it's a lot more of a hot mess. It kind of gets everywhere, but we will use direct from the embossing pad onto the folder for triple embossing. For triple embossing, we can really make that work to our advantage. Okay, so here I'm doing the other side now. So this is the indented side when it's lying down, which will give us a dented side. It's really confusing you. I'm so sorry. You'll see what I mean. So I have inked up the side that has got the indents in it, and then that way the ink is on the background rather than on the leaves. And this is another great effect. So depending on what you fancy and the look you're going for and how much of that embossing powder you want to show, depends on which side of the embossing folder you use. So I really do like this look, especially with the gold, which I'll do in a minute. So I do gold, and this is pearlescent cardstock, so it's slightly shiny. But you can see the two differences here. Depending on what you feel like you want your look to look like, that's where you're going to put your embossing powder. So here it is in gold. Now you can see at the bottom I've kind of missed some spots where I didn't ink up very well using my embossing ink on my brayer. If you have that happen, if you've got one of these kind of pens, you can just color in those areas and sort of touch it up. You can still see some of the marks when I do heat set it, but it looks much better than it just being white and empty space. So if you do have an issue, you can go ahead and always touch up your cards when you're finished heat and setting, and then add some more embossing powder and heat set it again. Now let's take these panels and turn them into some cards. So the first thing I want to do is work out how big I want my panel to be on my card base. So I've cut myself some vanilla cardstock and created a card base for my panels. And the next thing I'm going to do is cut them down slightly. So I thought I wanted to have a go at making sort of a split card. So I'm trimming these down so that they are about 2 centimeters smaller than the card base. So I've got a nice sort of wide border around it. If I put it on the front of the card, you can see here. And this allows me to create a gap in the middle of my card. So I'm going to take that card panel, I'm going to put it in my paper trimmer, and I'm going to line it up corner to corner so it's on a diagonal in my paper trimmer. So you can see I'm lining up that top left corner with the bottom right corner, and as long as those two corners are touching on that cut line, then when I put my trimmer blade through there, it will cut nice and perfect and diagonal, and I will have two completely equal triangular shapes. Now this is a fun little way that you can jazz up the front of your card without too much brain power involved. So now I can take my card panels and you can see if I squidge them to each corner, I get that nice little gap in the middle. Now to save on having to use foam tape and kind of trim it down to get into those triangular ends of my shapes, I decided that I would cut myself a little square panel out of foam. So this is just kids' fun foam. And then I would do the exact same thing, cut it on a diagonal, and I cut my fun foam to be just ever so slightly smaller than my top panels, and that way it can hide nice and neat behind the triangular pieces. Now this is block adhesive glue from Craftelier in Spain, and this glue is amazing. It's like super duper strong and sticks to pretty much everything. So when I use things like foam, I will use this kind of glue because I know it will stick quick and it will stick strong. So this is a great glue to have in your stash if you are working with different kinds of materials. It does seem to adhere a lot of different sorts of materials. And it's quite affordable, and they have it on sale quite often as well, which is really nice. So I'm going to add some glue onto my fun foam and stick it onto my card, and I'm kind of tucking it nice and neat up into each corner with a tiny little border around it. I'm going to take my T-ruler and measure that middle point to work out how big my strip of cardstock needs to be for my sentiment. So I've got some gold cardstock that I'm cutting here, and I got some craft cardstock. I went and grabbed my happy and birthday stamp sets from Trinity Stamps and from my stash and got those ready, lined them up my stamp platform so I could stamp down happy and birthday on that nice little strip, and I kind of gave myself some wiggle room on each end so I could aim for the middle of the card. So I'm adding some liquid adhesive just to make it easier to line these up nice and central, as I've cut the back panel to be slightly bigger than the top one, or my little strips I should say. And my little strip is about 1/8 of an inch smaller than the hole that I've got in the middle of my card. So I can slide that into place and have a tiny bit of a border between those strips and the actual card base itself. Now I'm going to apply some liquid glue, slide it into place where I want it to go, and then just simply trim off the excess. Really quick and easy way to make a really lovely, complicated looking card without it being complicated. To finish it off, I'm just going to add a few gems on it to add a little bit more sparkle and bling using my homemade DIY Picky Up tool, which is a chopstick with some blue tack on the end. Not everything in your craft room needs to be expensive. You can use really cheap supplies to create really fun tools. So that's my first card done, and then my other one I went ahead and did off screen, and I did it the other angle so you can see what it looks like. And that one I added on some twine before I stuck down the panel. And then again, I added on some gems, but this time I used some sort of rounded gems rather than the more like diamond-shaped gems. And these gems are all from Alina Craft's shop, so I'll link those down below for you as well if you want. And I'll link all the embossing folders and powders I'm using as well. And for my gold panel, I decided to back it onto some glitter cardstock. And then I used these dies here to make my sentiment panel. Now, I felt like the die that was the next size up from this sentiment panel was a bit too big. So one of the tricks you can do is you can cut two of the exact same size and then just trim off sort of the middle bits of that die cut. So I'm just trimming off those little bumpy bits that stick out, and then that way when I stick it behind the sentiment, it looks like I've used two dies, but I've actually just used one, so I can back it with a little bit of a border. Now I went and stamped birthday wishes and heat set that with some embossing powder. And then I can go ahead and attach those little tiny back panels that I just cut out of the same size die. And I will use my block adhesive again because this is glitter cardstock. And sometimes I find glitter doesn't really want to stick very well. So if I use this glue, it sticks beautifully. I decided to add some foam tape to the back of my sentiment to pop it up off my card a little bit. And off screen, I went ahead and added some gold twine around that I wrapped around the card panel before I glued it onto my card base. So I've got that little bit of extra texture going on in the background. And I can go ahead and pop that right nice and central on my card, and that finishes off that card. I added a little funny sentiment on the inside as well with one of my stamp sets, just to add a little bit more to the card. So here are the 3 finished cards from doing the double embossing technique, and we're going to step it up now a notch, and we're going to go for some triple embossing. For this technique, it's all the exact same tools, but I'm going to add in a little brush as well to add that triple layer. So for this technique, you really want 3 completely different colors. You want 3 that are going to stand out apart from each other, and I'll share with you towards the end the first ones that I tried and how they didn't really quite work. So for this technique, we are using the bumpy side only of the embossing folder, and we are going to start by dragging our embossing ink over that side. Now a big tip is to always lay your cardstock on the opposite side and then fold the cover over onto it so that you don't end up having the embossing ink bounce around at all. Note to self, make sure you're paying attention as to what side you pull out, because here my mind got a little confused. I poured on my embossing powder and then I went, nothing's sticking. I realized I had the wrong side. So here you can see, oh, nothing's stuck. Flipped it over, added my powder onto the back side, and obviously it's sticking into all those creases. Now I am using a slightly more detailed embossing folder. So the leaves one that I used at the very beginning, you would struggle with slightly because there is a lot of sort of white space, whereas this has got more detail in it. It's a lot more compressed, and this is where the triple embossing folder is really, really handy. The 3D embossing folder, not triple embossing folder. 3D embossing folder is really handy because you can really work those layers. So that first layer was direct to the folder from the ink pad, and now we are using the brayer, so I can just slide my embossed cardstock right into place because it's so detailed, it just pops right where it wants to go, and then I can add my second color on. So I'm adding on my second color to the areas where I have brayered the ink on, and you can see that you can still see the pink underneath because the ink pad covered more than the brayer covers. So the brayer is kind of hitting that second level of the 3D embossing folder. So I've added on that second layer, and you can really start to see those colors kind of interact with each other a bit. Now to get the third layer, we are going to go over the bumpy part of the embossed cardstock. So here I'm rubbing my finger over the areas where you can see it's just white. Those white areas are actually the areas that are raised up in that cardstock. So I'm going to take this little makeup brush. It's just a flat, quite firm bristled brush. I'm dipping it into my embossing ink, and I am just rubbing that over top of those raised areas. So I'm just catching those bumpy raised areas with that embossing ink, and it really doesn't take very long, but it gives you such a striking look. So now I can add my embossing powder, and this again is where you can tweak it. If you've missed some spots, come in with your brush again, add a bit more embossing powder on top of that. If you've got too much and you wanted it to be a bit more detailed, grab a nice little skinny paintbrush and just remove the embossing powder. So you can go through and change up those details a little bit, but look at this. How great does this look? My next sample is amazing. I used 3 colors I didn't think would go together at all. They're completely different and it looks even more amazing. So you can see the pink, you can see the red, you can see the gold. You get this gorgeous background. You can use as a background on a card. So here's the 3 colors I just picked at random that I thought were as opposite from each other as they could be. And look how stunning this is. This is probably my favorite panel out of all the ones I did today. I love it. The shine, the pops of color, they're just so much fun. Now I did try and do this on some colored cardstock as well. I thought maybe I could get like 4 colors going on in my card, but sadly I used quite a few that were translucent. And anything with a T next to it is for translucent, and translucent means that you will see through it. So that purple embossing ink, you can't see. Because I use purple cardstock and the translucent purple embossing powder, you can't really see it very well. So just bear that in mind when you're using your embossing powders, that you want opaque embossing powders if you're going to layer them onto a colored cardstock, if you want more color in your cards. So here you can see the one where I did it on white, and you can really see that red, and then the one I did on the red, you can't really see very well apart from where I mucked up and got a whole big blotch of it at the top left there. So this is a really fun way to step up your card making and kind of add a bit more oomph to those embossing powders and embossing folders. I hope you enjoyed creating with me today, and I hope you have a go as well. If you've not got 3D embossing folders, have a go with the 2D ones and see if it works as well. It may do. You never know until you try. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. Hope you have a fantastic weekend and a lovely week ahead, and I'll see you next weekend for some more crafting and more fun. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and drop me a comment down below, and I'll see you next time. Take care. Bye.